Jeffrey Dahmer's early life in Milwaukee was marked by a series of unsettling experiences that laid the groundwork for the horrific path he would later follow. Born on May 21, 1960, Dahmer was the eldest son of Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. From the outside, his childhood seemed relatively normal, but beneath the surface, there were signs of a troubled mind in the making. Dahmer's parents had a tumultuous relationship, characterized by constant arguments and emotional distance. His mother, Joyce, struggled with depression and was often described as emotionally volatile. She attempted suicide on more than one occasion, leaving young Jeffrey to witness the fragility of his home life. His father, Lionel, was a chemist, but his demanding career meant he was often absent, leaving Jeffrey without a strong paternal figure during critical stages of his development. This parental discord and neglect created a sense of isolation in Dahmer, who became increasingly withdrawn as he grew older. One of the most disturbing aspects of Dahmer's childhood was his early fascination with dead animals. While many children might be curious about nature, Jeffrey's interest took a dark turn. He began collecting roadkill, which he would dissect in a makeshift laboratory he set up in a hut behind his family's home. Armed with knowledge from his father's chemistry books, Dahmer learned how to preserve animal bones, a practice that foreshadowed his later obsession with the human body. The meticulousness with which he dissected these animals and his interest in their internal structures were early indicators of his growing detachment from normal social behavior and empathy. These actions, combined with his increasingly isolated nature, suggest the early development of a deep seated psychological disturbance. Dahmer's dissection of animals wasn't just a curiosity, it was a precursor to his later crimes. He derived a sense of control and power from these acts, which likely provided a disturbing form of comfort amid the chaos of his home life. As he entered adolescence, Dahmer's behavior became even more concerning. He started drinking heavily at a young age, using alcohol as a means to escape his feelings of alienation and inadequacy. This substance abuse further exacerbated his antisocial tendencies, and by the time he reached high school, Dahmer was an outcast. His classmates described him as a loner who would often sit in the back of the classroom, drinking from a bottle he kept hidden in his jacket. His peculiar behavior and lack of social connections went largely unnoticed by adults, allowing his dark fantasies to ferment unchecked. In summary, Jeffrey Dahmer's early life was a perfect storm of neglect, isolation, and budding psychopathy. His fascination with the dead, combined with a profound sense of loneliness, set the stage for the monstrous acts he would later commit. The seeds of his future violence were sown in those early years, nurtured by a home environment that failed to provide the stability and guidance he so desperately needed. This section of Dahmer's life is crucial in understanding how the boy who dissected animals in his backyard would grow into one of America's most notorious serial killers. The turning point in Jeffrey Dahmer's life came in the summer of 1978, just a few weeks after his high school graduation. It was June 18th, a day that would mark the beginning of his descent into the horrifying world of murder and necrophilia. On this day, Dahmer committed his first murder, targeting Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker whose tragic fate would haunt Dahmer for years to come. Stephen Hicks was an 18-year-old young man on his way to a rock concert when he encountered Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer, who was driving aimlessly, spotted Hicks walking along the road and offered him a ride. The two struck up a conversation, and Dahmer invited Hicks back to his parents' house for a few beers. Hicks, unaware of Dahmer's dark intentions, accepted the offer. Once at the house, the two drank together, but when Hicks decided it was time to leave, Dahmer panicked. Fearing abandonment, a recurring theme in his life, Dahmer struck Hicks on the head with a dumbbell, rendering him unconscious. In a moment of frenzied impulse, Dahmer strangled Hicks to death with the same dumbbell. This act of violence was not premeditated, but rather a sudden outburst driven by Dahmer's overwhelming fear of losing control and being left alone. After killing Hicks, Dahmer was faced with the daunting task of disposing of the body. He dissected the corpse in the basement of his home, using the same tools and techniques he had once employed on the animals he dissected as a child. The dismemberment of Hicks' body was methodical, almost clinical, as if Dahmer was trying to distance himself from the horror of his actions. He later crushed the bones and scattered them in the woods behind his house, while other parts of the body were dissolved in acid, a practice Dahmer would later become infamous for. The murder of Stephen Hicks had a profound psychological impact on Dahmer. This was the first time he had crossed the line from fantasy to reality, and the thrill he experienced during the act left an indelible mark on his psyche. However, it also filled him with a deep sense of guilt and fear. Dahmer later confessed that he tried to suppress the memory of the murder, but it continually resurfaced, fueling his compulsions and leading him down an increasingly dark path. This first murder set the stage for Dahmer's future crimes. The combination of violence, control, and necrophilia that characterized the murder of Stephen Hicks would become the blueprint for Dahmer's subsequent killings. The dismemberment and disposal of the body, done with a disturbing level of detachment, revealed Dahmer's burgeoning obsession with total control over his victims, an obsession that would only grow stronger as he continued to kill. In retrospect, the murder of Stephen Hicks was the moment when Dahmer's fantasies became a horrifying reality. It was a point of no return, marking the beginning of a killing spree that would last over a decade and claim the lives of 16 more young men. For Dahmer, this first murder was not just an act of violence, it was the fulfillment of a deeply rooted need for control, and it would come to define the rest of his life. The psychological impact of this murder, coupled with Dahmer's inability to stop himself, set him on a path of destruction that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The years between 1978 and 1987 represent a period of relative calm or dormancy in Jeffrey Dahmer's murderous career, but they were anything but peaceful for him personally. After the murder of Stephen Hicks, Dahmer found himself grappling with the enormity of what he had done. This internal struggle, combined with his already growing issues with alcohol, led to a nearly decade-long hiatus from killing, during which he tried and failed to maintain a semblance of normalcy. In an attempt to put his life back on track, Dahmer enrolled at Ohio State University in the fall of 1978. However, his drinking problem quickly spiraled out of control and he dropped out after just one term. His father, Lionel Dahmer, who was desperate to instill some discipline in his son, urged Jeffrey to enlist in the U.S. Army. In January 1979, Dahmer did just that, hoping that military life would offer him a fresh start and help him escape the demons that haunted him. Dahmer was stationed in Germany as a combat medic, a role that required a high level of responsibility and care. However, the structure and discipline of military life did little to curb his alcoholism. In fact, his drinking worsened and he became increasingly isolated from his fellow soldiers. Reports from those who served with him describe a man who was often drunk and unreliable, displaying little interest in making connections or participating in the social aspects of military life. His alcoholism severely affected his performance, leading to a deterioration in his duties. While stationed in Germany, there were no confirmed murders, but later investigations would reveal that Dahmer might have committed sexual assaults during this period. However, these incidents remain largely speculative as they were never fully proven or investigated at the time. What is clear is that Dahmer's time in the military was marked by a continued descent into alcohol dependency, further alienating him from any support systems that might have helped him change his path. In March 1981, Dahmer's drinking problem reached a breaking point. He was deemed unsuitable for military service and was discharged. The discharge was not dishonorable, but it was clear that the military had no place for someone with Dahmer's severe issues. Upon his discharge, Dahmer was sent back to the United States, where he briefly stayed with his father before moving in with his grandmother in West Allis, a suburb of Milwaukee. Returning to civilian life did little to improve Dahmer's situation. His alcoholism persisted, and the dark urges that had led him to kill Stephen Hicks never fully went away. During his time living with his grandmother, Dahmer attempted to lead a more normal life, attending church with her and even holding down a few jobs. However, the peace was superficial. The same internal conflicts and compulsions that had driven him before the military continued to simmer beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to erupt. This period in Dahmer's life is crucial in understanding the cyclical nature of his behavior. His time in the military was an unsuccessful attempt to impose order and discipline on a life that was increasingly chaotic and out of control. While he managed to avoid killing during these years, the combination of isolation, unresolved psychological issues, and worsening alcoholism set the stage for the next phase of his crimes. The return to Milwaukee, far from being a new beginning, marked the beginning of Dahmer's return to the horrific path he had briefly left behind. The dormant period was over, and it would not be long before Dahmer would kill again. The year 1987 marked the reawakening of Jeffrey Dahmer's murderous impulses, leading to the brutal killing of Stephen Chuomi and the beginning of a more frequent and horrific killing spree. This murder not only ended Dahmer's nearly decade-long period of dormancy, but also set the tone for the increasingly violent and ritualistic nature of his future crimes. Stephen Chuomi, a 25-year-old man, became Dahmer's second known victim on November 20th, 1987. Dahmer encountered Chuomi at a bar in Milwaukee where he persuaded him to accompany him to a hotel room for the night. Unlike his first murder, which had been impulsive, the murder of Chuomi was driven by Dahmer's growing obsession with control, domination, and his desire to fulfill his increasingly dark fantasies. Dahmer's account of the events that night revealed that he had no intention of killing Chuomi when they arrived at the hotel. However, after a night of heavy drinking, Dahmer claimed that he woke up to find Chuomi's lifeless body next to him, with no memory of how the killing occurred. This blackout could have been a psychological defense mechanism or simply the result of his excessive drinking, but it was clear that Dahmer's inner urges had taken over. In a panic, Dahmer purchased a large suitcase and transported Chuomi's body to his grandmother's house, where he proceeded to dismember the corpse in the basement. The dismemberment process was methodical and calculated. Dahmer disposed of the remains over several days, crushing bones and discarding the flesh in the garbage, much like he had done with his first victim, Stephen Hicks. However, there was one significant difference. Dahmer began to keep trophies. He preserved Chuomi's skull and retained it as a macabre souvenir, a practice that would become a hallmark of his later killings. The murder of Stephen Chuomi was pivotal for several reasons. First, it marked the point at which Dahmer's violent urges began to escalate uncontrollably. The brutality of the crime and the calculated manner in which Dahmer disposed of the body indicated that he was becoming more comfortable with his actions and, more importantly, more addicted to the power and control he felt during the murder and dismemberment process. This murder also demonstrated Dahmer's increasing detachment from reality. He was no longer just a young man struggling with dark fantasies. He had become a predator driven by an insatiable need to dominate and destroy. In the aftermath of Chuomi's murder, Dahmer's killings became more frequent and more brutal. He began actively seeking out victims, primarily targeting vulnerable young men whom he could easily overpower and manipulate. The pattern was set. He would lure his victims to a secluded place, drug them, and then proceed to satisfy his horrific desires. The cycle of violence that started with Chuomi continued to spiral, with Dahmer refining his methods and becoming more confident in his ability to evade capture. Stephen Chuomi's death was not just another crime, it was the catalyst for the series of murders that would follow, each more depraved than the last. Dahmer's ability to compartmentalize his actions, viewing his victims as objects rather than people, allowed him to continue his killing spree for years without remorse or guilt. The murder of Chuomi was a clear indication that Dahmer had fully embraced his identity as a serial killer, setting the stage for the horror that would unfold in the years to come. As Jeffrey Dahmer's killing spree continued, his methods of murder evolved into a chillingly calculated process that reflected his deepening obsession with control and domination. What began as spontaneous acts of violence grew into a meticulously orchestrated series of murders where each victim was subjected to increasingly horrific forms of abuse, manipulation, and ultimately death. Dahmer's modus operandi involved several key elements that became more refined with each murder. His approach typically began with the selection of his victims. Dahmer frequented bars, shopping malls, and bus stations, targeting young men who appeared vulnerable or isolated. Many of his victims were African American or of Asian descent, often marginalized individuals whom Dahmer believed would not be immediately missed. He would lure these men to his apartment with promises of money, alcohol, or simply companionship. Once inside, the true nature of Dahmer's intentions would unfold. One of Dahmer's most disturbing methods was his use of sedatives to incapacitate his victims. He would spike their drinks with drugs, rendering them unconscious and completely at his mercy. This allowed Dahmer to exert total control over them, fulfilling his fantasies of having an unresisting, compliant partner. Once his victims were unconscious, Dahmer would engage in necrophilia, acting out his twisted desires on their lifeless or semi conscious bodies. This need for control extended beyond the physical act of murder. It was about possessing his victims in the most absolute sense, turning them into objects for his gratification. As his crimes progressed, Dahmer's behavior became even more grotesque. He began experimenting with cannibalism, consuming parts of his victims as a way to internalize and retain them forever. This act of cannibalism was not just about satisfying a morbid curiosity, it was an extreme expression of dominance and control, as if by consuming his victims, he could make them a permanent part of himself. Dahmer later admitted that eating his victims made him feel powerful, further highlighting his need to exert control even beyond death. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Dahmer's modus operandi was his attempts to create living zombies. In his most twisted effort to maintain control over his victims, Dahmer experimented with crude lobotomies. He would drill holes into the skulls of his victims while they were still alive and inject acid or boiling water into their brains, hoping to induce a permanent, submissive state where they would be alive but entirely under his control. These attempts were as grotesque as they were futile, leading only to the agonizing deaths of his victims. This gruesome practice exemplified Dahmer's complete detachment from humanity and his descent into a nightmarish realm of depravity. Dahmer's evolution as a killer was marked by a progressively darker obsession with control and a desire to erase any semblance of human will or autonomy in his victims. His methods became more brutal and calculated as he sought to satisfy his increasingly perverse fantasies. The combination of drugging, necrophilia, cannibalism, and the attempts at creating living zombies reflects a chilling progression from mere murder to a perverted form of domination, where the lines between life and death, control and destruction, were horrifyingly blurred. In the end, Dahmer's evolving modus operandi was a reflection of his deepest fears and desires. His need to control, to dominate, and to possess his victims in every conceivable way was a driving force behind his actions. As he became more adept at evading detection, his confidence grew, and so did the complexity and brutality of his crimes. Each murder was not just an act of violence, but a calculated move in a dark ritual of control, one that ultimately defined Dahmer as one of the most notorious serial killers in history. Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes are among the most shocking in modern history, not only because of the sheer number of victims, but also due to the grotesque rituals he performed on their bodies. Among these, his acts of cannibalism and the preservation of body parts stand out as particularly horrifying. These practices were not random acts of violence. They were deeply rooted in Dahmer's psychological needs and offered a twisted form of fulfillment that went beyond mere murder. Cannibalism, in Dahmer's case, was an extension of his desire for control and possession. By consuming parts of his victims, Dahmer believed he could make them a permanent part of himself, a way to ensure they could never leave him. He later confessed that eating his victims made him feel as though they were living on inside him, offering a perverse sense of comfort and connection that he could not achieve in life. This act of consumption was, for Dahmer, an intimate experience that transcended the physical act. It was about establishing a bond that death alone could not sever. The process of cannibalism for Dahmer was not an impulsive act, but rather a carefully considered ritual. He described how he would prepare the flesh, often frying it with condiments in a grotesque parody of a meal. The clinical way in which he approached this act highlights his complete detachment from the humanity of his victims. To Dahmer, these men were not individuals with their own lives and stories. They were objects to be used, consumed, and preserved in whatever way he saw fit. Preservation was another key aspect of Dahmer's rituals. He kept trophies from his victims' skulls, bones, and even entire skeletons carefully cleaned and displayed in his apartment. These preserved body parts served as mementos of his crimes, allowing him to relive the experience of the murders long after the act was complete. Dahmer's apartment was a macabre museum, where he surrounded himself with the remnants of his victims as if they were objects of art. The preservation of these body parts had symbolic significance for Dahmer. Each skull or bone represented not just a past act of violence, but a symbol of control, a way to retain the essence of the person he had killed. The meticulous care with which he cleaned and arranged these remains suggests that Dahmer found a sense of order and stability in these objects, something he desperately lacked in his chaotic inner world. These preserved parts were more than just trophies, they were symbols of his ultimate power over life and death. Psychologically, Dahmer's rituals of cannibalism and preservation can be seen as attempts to address his deep seated fears of abandonment and loneliness. His childhood had been marked by emotional neglect and isolation, leading him to seek out ways to exert control over others in a manner that would prevent them from ever leaving him. Cannibalism, in this sense, was the ultimate act of possession. By consuming his victims, Dahmer believed he could internalize them, making them a permanent part of himself. Preservation, on the other hand, allowed him to maintain a physical connection to his victims, keeping their presence with him even after death. In the end, Dahmer's grisly rituals were a manifestation of his profound psychological disturbances. They were acts driven by a need to possess, control, and dominate in ways that transcended the physical realm. The acts of cannibalism and preservation were not just about satisfying morbid curiosities, they were about fulfilling a deep, pathological need for connection and control, no matter how twisted and perverse that connection might be. Through these rituals, Dahmer sought to fill the void within himself, a void that no amount of violence or consumption could ever truly satisfy. Jeffrey Dahmer's criminal activities spanned over a decade, during which there were several moments where law enforcement came frustratingly close to ending his spree. These near misses are a stark reminder of the importance of vigilance and thorough investigation. Perhaps the most poignant and tragic of these close calls involves the case of Conrad Synthesamphone. In May 1991, Dahmer lured 14-year-old Konrak Synthesamphone to his apartment under the pretense of taking photos in exchange for money. After drugging the boy, Dahmer attempted a horrifying experiment, trying to turn him into a living zombie by drilling a hole into his skull and injecting acid into his brain. Despite this, Konrak somehow managed to escape and was found wandering the streets, disoriented and in need of help. Two concerned women discovered the boy and quickly called the police. When officers arrived, they found Dahmer at the scene, who calmly explained that Konrak was his 19-year-old lover and that they had had a quarrel. Dahmer's composure and the biases of the time led the officers to accept his explanation without further investigation. Tragically, they returned Konrak to Dahmer's apartment, where he was ultimately killed. This moment represents a critical failure to protect a vulnerable individual and highlights how dangerous assumptions can be when investigating potential crimes. This was not the only time Dahmer narrowly avoided detection. Complaints from neighbors about foul odors and strange noises emanating from Dahmer's apartment were often dismissed or inadequately followed up. Dahmer's ability to appear normal and trustworthy allowed him to evade capture for years, even as the evidence of his crimes grew. The case of Konrak Sinthasomphone is a tragic example of the consequences of missed opportunities. Had the police taken more time to investigate Dahmer's story, or had they been more skeptical of his explanations, Konrak's life and perhaps the lives of other victims might have been spared. This story underscores the importance of thoroughness and the need to question surface appearances. It's a lesson in the critical role law enforcement plays in safeguarding the community and the dire consequences when warning signs are overlooked. The chilling saga of Jeffrey Dahmer came to an abrupt and dramatic end on July 22, 1991, marking a turning point that would finally bring justice for his many victims. The events leading to his arrest began when Tracy Edwards, a man Dahmer had lured to his apartment under the pretense of offering money for photographs, managed to escape from the clutches of the serial killer. This escape set off a chain of events that would expose the horrors hidden within Dahmer's apartment and bring his reign of terror to a close. On that fateful evening, Dahmer had taken Edwards back to his apartment with the intent to continue the grisly pattern he had established with his previous victims. However, as Dahmer began to prepare for his ritualistic acts, Edwards sensed the danger he was in. With remarkable presence of mind, Edwards waited for an opportune moment and then fled the apartment, running into the street, still partially restrained by handcuffs. Desperate for help, he flagged down two police officers, Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller, who were patrolling the area. The officers, recognizing Edward's distress, accompanied him back to Dahmer's apartment to retrieve the key to the handcuffs. What they found inside was beyond anything they could have imagined. Upon entering the apartment, Officer Mueller noticed a series of Polaroid photographs in an open drawer. The images depicted dismembered bodies in various stages of dissection. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the officers immediately called for backup and placed Dahmer under arrest. As the police began to search the apartment, the full extent of Dahmer's atrocities came to light. The small, one-bedroom unit was filled with evidence of his crimes, skulls and bones meticulously preserved and displayed, jars containing human organs, and a large vat filled with acid, which Dahmer used to dissolve the remains of his victims. In the refrigerator, officers made the most shocking discovery of all: a freshly severed human head, carefully stored as if it were just another piece of food. The scene was a nightmare, a grotesque gallery of horror that defied comprehension. For the officers, the realization that they had stumbled upon one of the most prolific and sadistic serial killers in modern history was overwhelming. The initial reactions were a mix of disbelief and revulsion as the officers and investigators tried to process the scale and brutality of the crimes committed within those walls. As news of Dahmer's arrest spread, the public was shocked by the details that emerged: the methodical way in which Dahmer had carried out his crimes, the sheer number of victims, and the grotesque rituals he performed were almost beyond belief. The final arrest of Jeffrey Dahmer not only ended a killing spree that had lasted for over a decade, but also opened the door to a deeper understanding of the darkness that had driven him. Dahmer's arrest was a moment of reckoning, not just for the victims' families, but also for a society that had, in many ways, been blind to the warning signs. The evidence found in Dahmer's apartment provided a stark and disturbing insight into the mind of a man who had managed to evade detection for so long, despite the growing pile of evidence that pointed to his monstrous acts. The events of that night, beginning with Tracy Edwards' escape and culminating in the shocking discoveries made by the police, marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in criminal history. Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest brought a measure of justice to his victims and ensured that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another innocent life. Jeffrey Dahmer's trial was one of the most anticipated and closely watched legal proceedings of the early 1990s. It wasn't just the nature of his crimes that drew attention, but also the psychological complexities surrounding his confessions and the defense's arguments. Dahmer's decision to plead guilty but insane set the stage for a courtroom drama that would deeply impact public perception and the legal process itself. The trial began on January 30th, 1992, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. From the outset, Dahmer's legal team, led by attorney Gerald Boyle, pursued a defense strategy centered around the claim that Dahmer was legally insane at the time of the murders. This plea of guilty but insane meant that Dahmer admitted to the killings but sought to convince the court that he was not responsible for his actions due to severe mental illness. The defense argued that Dahmer's compulsions were uncontrollable, driven by deep psychological disturbances, and that he should be committed to a mental institution rather than a prison. Dahmer's confessions played a pivotal role in the trial. During the investigation, he had provided police with detailed, chilling accounts of his crimes, describing his methods, motivations, and the rituals he performed. He spoke candidly about his desire to control and dominate his victims, his attempts to create living zombies, and his acts of cannibalism. These confessions were not only shocking, but also revealed the extent to which Dahmer had planned and executed his crimes with a clear sense of purpose. The prosecution, led by Michael McCann, countered the insanity defense by arguing that Dahmer was fully aware of the wrongfulness of his actions. They pointed to the methodical nature of his crimes, the lengths to which he went to conceal evidence, and his ability to lure and manipulate his victims as proof that he was not insane but rather coldly calculating. The prosecution emphasized that Dahmer had shown a clear understanding of the law, as evidenced by his efforts to avoid detection, such as his use of locks, acid, and his careful disposal of remains. The impact of Dahmer's confessions on public perception was profound. The sheer brutality of his crimes, combined with his detailed and emotionless recounting of them, painted a picture of a man who was both deeply disturbed and fully in control of his actions. This duality of a man capable of such horrific acts, yet so composed in describing them, left many in the public and the media grappling with how to view him, as a monster beyond comprehension or as a deeply ill individual who needed treatment. The jury ultimately sided with the prosecution. On February 15, 1992, Dahmer was found legally sane and was convicted of 15 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, totaling 957 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. The verdict affirmed that while Dahmer may have been mentally ill, his actions were driven by a conscious decision to commit crimes that he knew were wrong. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer left a lasting impact on the legal community and the public at large. It raised difficult questions about the nature of insanity, the limits of criminal responsibility, and how society should deal with individuals who commit such heinous acts. Dahmer's case has since become a reference point in discussions about the insanity defense and the complexities of criminal psychology. In the end, Dahmer's trial was not just about securing a conviction, it was about understanding the mind of a killer and grappling with the implications of his actions. The courtroom became a space where the darkest aspects of human nature were laid bare, forcing everyone involved to confront the unsettling reality of what one person was capable of. After his conviction, Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to serve 15 consecutive life terms at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Life behind bars marked a significant shift for Dahmer, both in terms of his daily existence and his psychological state. While his prison life was relatively quiet at first, it was eventually marked by a series of dramatic developments that culminated in his violent death at the hands of another inmate. Upon entering prison, Dahmer was placed in protective custody, separated from the general population due to the notoriety of his crimes and the risk of being targeted by other inmates. However, as time went on, Dahmer reportedly expressed a desire to be integrated into the general prison population, despite the dangers it posed. This move reflected a complex and perhaps self destructive side of Dahmer, who seemed at times indifferent to his own safety. One of the most unexpected aspects of Dahmer's time in prison was his conversion to Christianity. He was baptized in May 1994 by Roy Ratcliffe, a minister who visited him regularly. Dahmer's conversion appeared sincere, with Ratcliffe later recounting that Dahmer expressed genuine remorse for his actions and a desire to find forgiveness through faith. This religious turn was met with skepticism by many, given the horrific nature of his crimes, but for Dahmer, it seemed to offer a form of solace in his final years. Dahmer's interactions with other inmates were less peaceful. While some reports suggest that he largely kept to himself, others indicate that Dahmer's presence in the general population was a source of tension. Some inmates reportedly viewed him as a figure of morbid fascination, while others harbored deep resentment toward him, not only for his crimes but also for the attention he received. This tension came to a head on November 28, 1994, when Dahmer was attacked and killed by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver. Dahmer, Scarver, and another inmate, Jesse Anderson, were assigned to a work detail cleaning a bathroom in the prison gymnasium. For reasons that remain somewhat unclear, Scarver attacked both Dahmer and Anderson with a metal bar he had retrieved from the gym's weight room. Dahmer was struck in the head multiple times and was pronounced dead shortly after the attack. Anderson, who had been convicted of murdering his wife, also succumbed to his injuries. Scarver later claimed that he was driven to kill Dahmer because of the nature of his crimes, as well as Dahmer's alleged behavior in prison, which included taunting other inmates by shaping his food into body parts and using ketchup to simulate blood. Scarver's actions were seen by some as a form of vigilante justice, though they also highlighted the dangerous environment within the prison and the unresolved anger that Dahmer's presence provoked among other inmates. The psychological impact of Dahmer's imprisonment was complex. On one hand, his conversion to Christianity suggested a search for redemption and inner peace. On the other hand, his eventual murder by Scarver underscored the deep and unresolved tensions that his crimes had created, both within himself and in those around him. Dahmer's death was met with a mix of relief, closure, and unresolved questions about his true state of mind, the sincerity of his religious conversion, and the broader implications of his life and crimes. In the end, Jeffrey Dahmer's life in prison was as tumultuous and unsettling as the life he led outside. His death, while violent and sudden, brought an end to the story of one of the most notorious criminals in history, a story that continues to provoke horror, fascination, and deep reflection on the darkest aspects of human nature. The aftermath of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes left a deep and lasting scar on the families of his victims. The emotional toll of losing a loved one to such brutal violence is unimaginable, and for many of these families, the pain persists to this day. The families had to grapple not only with the loss itself, but also with the horrifying details of how their loved ones were murdered and what was done to their bodies afterward. Many of these families were thrust into the public eye, forced to confront the gruesome realities of Dahmer's crimes as they were revealed in court and through media coverage. This exposure only compounded their grief, making it difficult to find peace and closure. Some families struggled with severe depression, anxiety, and other long-term psychological impacts as they tried to cope with the brutal nature of their loved ones' deaths. The legal battles that followed Dahmer's conviction added another layer of complexity to the family's grief. Some families sought compensation from Dahmer's estate, though the process was often lengthy and fraught with legal hurdles. In some cases, these legal proceedings reopened old wounds as families were forced to relive the details of the crimes in the pursuit of justice. The emotional toll on the families is perhaps best encapsulated in the courtroom outbursts and heartfelt statements made during Dahmer's trial. Family members expressed their profound pain, anger, and sense of betrayal not just by Dahmer, but also by a system that they felt had failed to protect their loved ones. These moments highlighted the deep, personal impact of Dahmer's actions, which extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass entire communities. Jeffrey Dahmer has been the subject of extensive psychological analysis as experts have attempted to understand what drove him to commit such heinous acts. Dahmer was diagnosed as a sadistic sociopath, a person with a personality disorder characterized by a lack of empathy, an inability to form genuine emotional connections, and a tendency toward manipulative and violent behavior. One of the most prominent theories about Dahmer's behavior centers around his need for control and dominance. Dahmer himself admitted that he was obsessed with the idea of possessing his victims completely, which is why he resorted to such extreme measures, including necrophilia and cannibalism. His attempts to create living zombies through crude lobotomies were an extension of this desire for control, as he sought to turn his victims into completely submissive beings who could not leave him. Another significant aspect of Dahmer's psychological profile was his deep seated feelings of isolation and rejection, which began in childhood and persisted throughout his life. These feelings may have contributed to his need to assert power over others in such an extreme and violent manner. Dahmer's alcohol abuse also played a role in his crimes as it often lowered his inhibitions and facilitated his violent impulses. The psychological evaluations of Dahmer have provided valuable insights into the mind of a serial killer, offering a glimpse into the extreme ends of human behavior. These analyses have been critical in understanding not only Dahmer's specific pathology, but also the broader patterns that might emerge in other cases of extreme violence. The media coverage of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes was extensive and, at times, sensationalistic. The gruesome details of his acts captured the public's imagination and sparked widespread horror and fascination. Headlines and news stories often focused on the most shocking aspects of Dahmer's behavior, including his acts of cannibalism and the preservation of body parts, which only heightened the public's morbid curiosity. This intense media scrutiny had several effects. On one hand, it brought attention to the failures in law enforcement and the justice system that allowed Dahmer to evade capture for so long. On the other hand, it also raised ethical questions about the way the media reports on such horrific crimes. Some argued that the sensationalism surrounding the case dehumanized the victims and their families, turning their tragedy into a spectacle for public consumption. Public reaction to Dahmer's crimes was a mix of revulsion, fear, and, for some, a morbid fascination. The case prompted discussions about the nature of evil, the psychology of serial killers, and the role of society in preventing such tragedies. However, the media's portrayal of Dahmer as a monster sometimes obscured the more complex psychological factors at play, simplifying the narrative into one of good versus evil. The coverage also led to broader conversations about mental illness, criminal responsibility, and how society should deal with individuals who commit such atrocities. While the media played a critical role in bringing Dahmer's crimes to light, it also highlighted the ethical dilemmas involved in reporting on such sensitive and disturbing subjects. Jeffrey Dahmer's case has had a profound impact on the field of criminal psychology, becoming a reference point for the study of serial killers. His crimes have been analyzed in depth by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement officials, all seeking to understand the motivations behind such extreme behavior and how it can be prevented in the future. Dahmer's case has contributed to the development of criminal profiling techniques, particularly in understanding the psychological traits common among serial killers, such as a lack of empathy, a need for control, and a pattern of escalating violence. His case has also underscored the importance of early intervention in cases where individuals exhibit signs of severe psychological distress or deviant behavior. In law enforcement, the Dahmer case has been used to train officers in identifying potential red flags that might indicate someone is capable of committing similar crimes. It has also led to discussions about the systemic failures that allowed Dahmer to continue his crimes for so long, emphasizing the need for better communication between law enforcement agencies, mental health professionals, and the community. Dahmer's influence extends beyond criminal psychology and law enforcement. His case has also permeated popular culture, influencing films, books, and television shows that explore the darker aspects of human nature. While this has helped to keep his story alive in the public consciousness, it also raises questions about the ethics of turning real life horror into entertainment. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer is a stark reminder of the darkest capabilities of human behavior. It forces society to confront uncomfortable truths about violence, mental illness, and the failures of the systems designed to protect us. While Dahmer's crimes are in many ways incomprehensible, they offer critical lessons about the importance of vigilance, the need for thorough investigation, and the dangers of overlooking or dismissing warning signs. The ongoing fascination with Dahmer's story reflects a broader human interest in understanding evil and how it manifests. True crime storytelling, while popular, comes with ethical responsibilities, particularly when dealing with real victims and their families. The lessons from Dahmer's case extend beyond the realm of criminal psychology and into broader societal questions about justice, morality, and the role of media in shaping public perception. As we reflect on the legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer, it is crucial to remember the victims' young men whose lives were brutally taken and the enduring pain of their families. The lessons learned from this case should serve as a foundation for preventing future tragedies, ensuring that the horrors of Dahmer's actions are never repeated.